It is August the 6th as we're recording this. And yesterday we had what some people, I guess, the people that are probably the most alarmist called Black Monday in a way. It was kind of Black Monday in Japan. Japanese markets, I think, were down 12% yesterday, which not that far off of the actual Black Monday of minus 22% back in 1987. They're up over 10% today, so kind of making some of that back. But some extreme volatility in the markets lately. Have you been following it at all? I mean, we had a holiday here in Canada, so I didn't really notice it that much yesterday.
So that was going to be my point. I mean, first of all, it's not as if the earnings of companies in Japan all of a sudden changed from Friday to Monday and then Monday to Tuesday in 12 and 10 double-digit swings on either day, right?
Or did the market values of these companies, the economic values of these companies, did they really change by that massive an amount just because of something going on in the news? And there was a few things. There was in Japan, they raised rates again, another 0.25%, which I don't know what that brings them to now, but they're just barely positive now, although rates have been negative for a long, long time in Japan. And they were also worried about, and this is the craziest thing I heard, a U.S. hard landing. So we're talking about the U.S. having unemployment rates a little bit higher than expected, and finally having, some move up in unemployment, which is something they've been waiting for a while. The Fed's been waiting for that so they could finally drop rates. ISM numbers, PMI numbers, whatever, slightly lower, just a little bit negative, and they're talking hard landing. It just boggles the mind. And
one of the things with the interest rate increase in Japan was that they referenced what is a carry trade. And I don't think we'll have the time to go into that and the theory behind it and why that was such an impact. Just remember carry trade. But I was camping in Banff and I was not in any digital, I should say I didn't have data access for the weekend. And it's a nice reminder that sometimes you just need to unplug a bit. Like I could still get phone calls from where I was at, but not data. None of the apps were working. And so I was actually quite blissfully unaware of what happened until I got a text message from somebody asking, making comment about, a U.S. recession potentially. And I actually asked them, could you give me some Olympic results instead? Because I was curious what was happening. And apparently the Elks won on the weekend too, so I didn't know about that.
There's something. That's the most unexpected news of the weekend. I would say market turmoil from various little minutia of stimulus. That's very expected, and especially. It seems the Japanese investors are a little bit more prone to reacting to whatever's going on in the news. I mean, you remember the night that Trump was elected, how much the Japanese markets went down that night and then recovered, obviously.
That's Egypt being the first to react, right?
And they are the first to react, and they have to anticipate what's going to happen. Europe and then the U.S. and so forth. And usually by the time the U.S. markets close, yesterday, obviously, markets in the U.S. were not down that much. I think 2%, 2 point something percent, down from being as bad as, negative 5-6% in the futures markets before they opened. Things were looking really bad. But again, for me, I just updated my post on volatility, my volatility first aid kit. It's a blog post I've had on my website for the longest time. It's at muhs.ca/volatility. And it's just something that I've had to update over the years. I think I originally posted in 2017. There's always volatility out there. There's always a reason to panic. There's a reason not to invest or to pull out your investments. Things are always darkest at the bottom of the markets. And the way how we build our wealth over the long term has always been to be invested, stay invested, stick with a strategy, and don't react. And the people on TV will always tell you the opposite. They'll give you a reason to react. That's what gets the clicks. That's what sells the commercials, and makes things interesting for them.
And as much as it gets refrained, gets often repeated from people who've gone through this multiple times. I mean, you and I, even in our, investment lifetimes, have gone through this a number of times as well, even within the last few years, right? And if you thought about a global pandemic a few years ago, shutting things down completely, that too passed. And whatever happened yesterday when I was camping, part of it passed already. And I'm not necessarily thinking about yesterday. It was a data point that I have to sort of look back on, but I'm looking forward. I'm looking forward into the future.
I've seen it so many times now. And I mean, I started in 2008 when things were really bad. I mean, really dire.
Mm-hmm.
We got out of that. The markets recovered by 2013. They were at new highs. And, then everything that's happened after that, I've become desensitized to the panic, really. I just think back of all the times I looked at, whatever day when markets just plummeted a whole lot, whether that was '08, summer 2011, 2018. There was, I think, there's the flash crash in 2010. There was a really bad day in August of 2015, I remember. And I just remember back to looking at those market charts for the day and seeing that big red number and just being baffled and kind of a little bit stressed and worried. But then it just happens so many times. And so many times it's been much worse, like you said, the pandemic, even a lot of the stuff that happened in 2022. It was good reason for the markets to go down as much as they did that year. And we got through it and we hit new highs again. And whenever we hit new highs, then I am always thinking, why did I even bother panicking? Why did I feel that stress, that pain back then?
Yeah.
And, at this point, it's just markets will do what they do. If you've been through it a couple of times, you realize to just tune it out. The problem is newer clients, newer investors, those just getting started. Maybe it's their first time and they just don't know how to react to it. That's why it's good to have a good advisor.
Yes. Stay the course. The reminder, what you call it advisor alpha, or in some firms and other places call it other things. But all in all, it's to remind people that, there's a plan in place, right? There should be a plan in place. There's a long-term approach that we all have. And generally speaking, any time frame, the longer you're invested, we've seen the charts, we've referenced them before, right? On a longer term time frame, you're almost always positive. And those reasons that you talked about, reasons to sell, they've all been sort of like blips along the way. And whatever yesterday was, right? And whatever the next one will be, right? It'll just be kind of a blip along the way, not being, too flippant again about it all.
Now, we're both conscious that, we're publishing for 2 weeks out. I actually just clicked publish on our last episode today. So 2 weeks from now, who knows where the markets will be? Right now, the drawdown is about negative 6-ish%, I think, from the all-time high, which is really, it's laughable that people are concerned about that when we've seen, negative 25, even in just the last 2 years. But in 2 weeks, whenever this publishes, who knows? The markets could be down 10%, 15%, 20% for all we know. It's still all we're saying still goes all the same. 20% decline does happen from time to time. Probably we're not due for one just yet, but if it's a negative 10%, we're usually due for one of those once every year. And the longer we go without one, the more overvalued the markets become, and the more painful things are when they do crash down. And that's just normal markets. It's inevitable. It's going to happen.
I think to a certain extent, there's been a bit of a paradigm shift, or there's a different world now in some senses. There's so many more variables. There's so many more inputs. There's so much more instantaneous reaction to things. Whereas, years ago, you'd actually literally have to wait for the machine to print out a ticker, and so you can kind of look at it. That was way before our time, right? And then there's other times where you just had to, wait. Now news is instantaneous. And as an individual, as an advisor, and with clients who have individual equities, right? It's not uncommon to see certain names, like even your Apples and your Amazons, the largest companies in the world, they're going up and down 2, 3, 4% sometimes in a day, unfortunately. And it's just become normalized, for better or for worse. Mostly, I think, for the worse.
As you mentioned earlier, we're talking hundreds of billions of dollars of company value. And if we're talking about the markets, I think yesterday they said, the news headline was something along X trillion dollars wiped out. Of course, wiped out again is just hyperbole, where nothing's ever wiped out. if a company goes under, if we're talking Wang Computers or something, that was wiped out, or Sears, that was wiped out. If Nvidia's share price, if its market cap goes down a couple $100 billion, it's not really wiped out, because at some point in the future, I don't want to say it will. I think it's overvalued as it is, but it may go up.
But Nvidia last week before the long weekend, one day, went down and went up, and the day went up, it was up over $300 billion, which I think was the largest single dollar value swing in market cap ever. And it happened, I think, last Thursday. A company moves $300 billion in value in a single day. Like,
these swings in value, I think you're right. They're staggering. I don't think they would have happened in the 80s, just because we wouldn't be so fixated on companies. The information didn't flow the way it did. there was no one looking online
No.
to see what the Japanese market was doing or what the futures were doing prior to an open market open. And as a result, I think we just didn't have as massive fluctuations. There wasn't a reason for the markets to trade down a stock by 20%.
Yeah.
And there's
which is now post results, like up, down, double digits, every week.
There's some extreme examples where a company saw its share price go down by like 75% and then come back. I mean, I don't know if Facebook was quite that extreme over 2022 and then recovering. But again, if you look at that as a business, did its profits really drop that much? Did its book value drop that much? It didn't. It was just that the markets are so fixated on a few companies that it causes such a massive swing in one company versus others. So when it comes to investing, we have no idea what the investing market will look like when this episode airs. What we do know, it'll be late August, I think late August or mid-August. And likely there will be a lot of parents withdrawing money from RESPs, Registered Education Savings Plans. Well, this would be a good time for another episode on RESPs. So back in, I guess last year around August, Justin and I, we did an episode on RESPs. And that one went quite extensive, talking about all the ins and outs of RESPs. And if you want to re-listen to that episode, it would be found on my website, on my RESP wiki page, as I call it, which is muhs.ca/RESP. So there we talked about all the ins and outs. I didn't want to go through all those details again today. Nothing's really changed this year for RESPs. I think the one change they made to the limits was last year. We'll touch on that in just a second here. But just on the topic of withdrawals, I brought up this topic just because I'm seeing way too often misconceptions around withdrawals. And in the end, a lot of bad planning, not necessarily anyone's fault, not necessarily the parents' fault. Sometimes it's just omission of information that RESP withdrawals are not done correctly often, whether at a bank or with an advisor even. Let's start with RESP withdrawals. Yeah. Why don't I ask you, Justin? What do we know about RESP withdrawals? How do they work?
Well, the point of investing in an RESP is to take advantage of the fact that it can grow, that at some point you're going to want to take it out for someone's education.
Right? You can grow tax deferred, and there's also some grant money that you get along with that. 20% of your contributions matched in Canada Education Savings Grant, and possibly more if you're certain levels of income and so on. So in a perfect world, you can then withdraw that. The growth and the grant money gets taxed in the kids' hands. Everything's tax deferred.
That's an important point.
Yep. That's shifting tax liability from yourself to your kids. You're, of course, if you're the parent, if you're the contributor, you're putting your after-tax money into the plan. So there's no taxes on taking your money back out. That's your own capital. It's already been taxed. But on all that growth, you're not only deferring it onto your kids who will likely be at a lower income level, lower tax rate, but also you're compounding that growth over many years and not paying tax all those years. In those ways, it's a really great plan. Now, some people, they are a little bit pessimistic about RESPs because they worry about the restrictions on when the money gets taken out. What if my kids don't go to school? If they don't go to school, do I get heavily penalized? Do I lose money? And similarly, I've heard and I've seen some talk on social media where some people are against them, some people are very much in favor of them. But with RESPs, there's some flexibility.
There is flexibility. And that's one thing I think is probably one of the misconceptions out there, is that when you put in your own money, or the sponsor, puts in funds into the RESP, yes, you get some funds from the government in the form of the grants. The subscriber. Yes, subscriber. Thank you.
Sponsors us, subscribers, the parents that puts the money into the plan.
Thank you. Yes, that's right. And then, there will be growth on the principal amount that was put in. And then there's also growth that goes on to the grant. And then maybe there's some other information as well. But then, how does it get split up, right? And there are a couple different moving parts, right? It's not rocket science, right? But it does, there is some planning that is involved, or I think that can be involved to efficiently take out those funds. And it's not in a uniform, it doesn't have to be in a uniform manner, because you want to have to take in consideration the student, the child, who is ultimately benefiting from the RESP. And then you also have to take in consideration, how much do they spend on their education, all things around their education. Did they work a part-time job or not? Did they get some scholarship money or not, right? And so a lot of these moving parts, they are, again, everybody's a bit different. Everyone's education is a bit different, where they go, what they do. Maybe they're working part-time or not, right? And so being able to understand those variables will then help dictate or guide, or at least to the dollar, but at least conceptually have an understanding that, a dollar in doesn't mean first in, first out, right? There are methods to be able to efficiently withdraw the funds out so that, it's lower tax for the student at the end of it all.
So when contributing to an RESP, it's really straightforward and simple. You just put money in, and some or all of the money gets a grant attached to it. Qualifies for grant. You can contribute more than what you would normally get in grant money each year. So generally that is about $2,500 per beneficiary, gets $500 worth of grant. That's where the grant is capped off. You can put more money in if you want, and that won't collect a grant. Some people do it because you still get the deferral of
sheltered
growth and income, sheltered growth in a way, deferred taxation down the road. But ideally, what a lot of my clients do with RESPs is they max it out each year. Not max it out totally, because maxing it out means putting $50,000 in over the lifetime, but they get it to the point where they're getting the maximum amount of grants. So they can collect that $7,200 worth of CESG over the lifetime of the plan for each beneficiary. And then hopefully eventually that helps their education. Now, when money comes out, like you said, that's where it gets a little more complicated. And that's really where the planning has to happen. So, you can go ahead and open that RESP at a bank with anyone and just put money in every year. You don't really need a lot of advice doing that, except when it comes to the investment. But when it comes to taking the money out, you need to do some actual planning. If you're not getting that at the bank, read my blog post to understand how RESPs work. But so there are these notional balances all along the way. One is your capital that went in. The other is the growth, what's called the accumulated income in the plan. And the other is the grant. They keep track. We the promoters, right? Yep. Sponsors, promoters. We track those numbers throughout the life of the plan. If the plan ever transfers from one institution to another, that information should get passed along to the other institution. And then when it comes time to withdrawing the money, a number of different things can happen. So one is if the kid is in school, then you can do a certain type of withdrawals. And if the kid doesn't go to school at all, then different types of withdrawals happen. Why don't we start with the in school, Justin? What type of withdrawals can we do then?
So I mentioned earlier that there's a couple different components, right? So there's the initial funds that were put into the RESP. And so that, again, because it was contributed on an after-tax basis, when you take that money out, it is not taxed again, right? So
capital,
oddly enough, maybe they planned it or not, they call it an ROC. My first thought line would be a return on capital. Another way of saying it's a refund of contributions. It's the same acronym, ROC. So you can take that money out. And let's say you did maximize, let's say you put in $2,500 for 1 year. You got the $500 worth of grant equivalent, right? If we just think about that in the future, you could take that $2,500 back out tax-free as a refund of contribution. And that $500, right, that you got as a grant would be considered an EAP. An educational assistance payment, and any of the growth that happened on the grant or on the principal, right, would also be comprised within that EAP. And so how you balance that out can be an important factor as to, because you can say, I'd like to take out $1,000 of ROC, refund of contributions, and I want to take $1,000 worth of EAP, the educational assistance payment. But not everybody you'd want to do it equally, right? Again, based on the taxation of the students. But two main buckets, EAP, ROC.
That's the big area where not enough planning happens and not enough advice often when it comes to those withdrawals. So typically, in most cases, I've seen those withdrawals from the RESP happen when the kid is in school. It's not very often that I've seen withdrawals happening where you're doing the other types of withdrawals, which are when the kid is not in school, or when you basically have given up on any chance of potentially drawing that money out for proper education assistance payments and what are also called post-secondary education withdrawals. So that ROC, really, there's two types of ROC withdrawals, really. There's the PSE, post-secondary education. If a beneficiary in the plan is attending university, you qualify to take that money out and not have the grants clawed back by the government. If, however, no beneficiaries in the plan are attending school, then it becomes basically a non-education capital withdrawal. Then the withdrawal will see the grant money that came with that original contribution clawed back, sent back to the government,
which is fair.
Yeah, but again, let's say typically in most cases you're going to see these withdrawals happening when they're in school. Then what I'm often seeing, or what I'm hearing happening, they're not doing that through me, and what actually I did see when I worked at the bank is people are given the choice. So you want to withdraw X amount of money for your kid's education. How would you like to do that, Mr. and Mrs. Client? We can do it this way, where a tax bill gets sent to junior, or we can do a tax-free withdrawal, capital withdrawal.
And tax-free sounds great. I always want tax-free.
Yeah. Well, without any further advice around that, people tend to gravitate towards that capital withdrawal, when it should be the exact opposite. And we'll get back to this. There's another issue that comes up, is that a real big, a preconception that people have about RESPs is that the withdrawal somehow needs to match what was spent on education. Maybe you've got the first tuition bill, and that's the amount of money you're going to withdraw. Or it's tuition and books, and that's what you're going to withdraw. And you're not going to withdraw more than that. And this might go kind of contrary to what a lot of advisors might recommend, is take the money out. You don't need to spend it necessarily, but you have to think of this when a child is enrolled in university, especially if it's a 4-year full-time degree. This is a window. This is your window to make tax-efficient withdrawals from the RESPs. That window closes at some point. It closes when they graduate, if they don't do any other education after that. It closes when they drop out. So you have to take the most advantage of this window. So a couple of things to keep in mind. The limits for full-time student, there's one limit on the first semester, $8,000 of education assistance payment. So that EAP amount that gets taxed in their hands, first semester you can only take out $8,000. It's a soft limit. And that's a change.
That's a change.
That was a recent change last year.
It was $5,000.
It was $5,000. It's $4,000 for part-time. That's only for that taxable amount. You can still take out $20,000, take out $12,000 of capital and $8,000 of EAP. But for that amount, and this is, again, the strategy around RESPs is you want to have EAPs. You want to be able to take advantage of the fact that you can then defer this money to your kid, have them pay at a really low tax rate, possibly no taxes at all on that money. And then who cares what happens with it then? It can go to a TFSA if they don't need to spend it. Go into a TFSA if either the child has room or you have room, and then the money can be given to the kids for education down the road. But again, it's your window to get that money out while they're in school. And again, getting back to this preconception, this mistake I see a lot of people making is they only take out that amount that they think they need for university, and then they leave the money in the plan, and then the kid graduates, or maybe they drop out, or if it's a family plan, all the kids have now graduated and there's still a bunch of money left in it that hasn't been taken out for EAP.
Nice
so
problem.
There's growth and grant money. You think it's a nice problem, but we'll get to that step next. What happens next? You no longer have that advantage of being able to take out EAPs after a certain amount of time.
So you brought up an interesting point about how you said you'd suggest to take out more than that is necessary. And so there's a reasonable amount, and reasonable is it's literally in quotations. It's a reasonable amount. The CRA actually only last year came out with a bit of a guidance, a bit of a list to actually said what is reasonable and what is not. And you could take up to $28,000 in a year without having to justify to the CRA and say, this is my line item list of all my expenses for the child, right? Here's tuition, here was the travel to get to the school, here was the moving costs, here was the rent. And so here's some things. That reasonable is not just tuition and fees, right?
After that first semester.
Yeah. It also includes things like, supplies for the education, computer equipment, moving expenses, right? Living, rent, food, right? Stuff that is you're using or you have to spend on in order to be able to go to school, right? And again, the CRA, if you take out $20,000 from your RESP, They are not going to come to you, knock on wood, and say, please provide us with an exact itemized list of expenses that you took up for this RESP. No, like the threshold is $28,000. It's quite high, right? And even within that, right? Again, all those other expenses, right? Like you can buy cutlery and plates, right, for the place that you're living in. You know, that last week of August, right, or like right now when this podcast, and video gets published, right? I guarantee you, IKEA is packed because every time I go in the end of summer, it is all these students and all their parents, and they're buying everything. They're buying plates, they're buying towels, they're buying dish, racks, they're buying, floor mats, garbage cans, right? Their Billy bookcase, whatever. They're buying a lot of stuff, and all that stuff is in support of the education. Those are reasonable costs.
And keep in mind, so what Justin's getting at is only if the amount withdrawn, the EAP amount is over 28,000, only then does the government even care. You can do a 25,000. So again, first semester they got that $8,000 limit. The $8,000 limit is just to prevent situations where you've taken advantage of the RESP all these years, and kid goes to school for one semester then drops out. You cannot empty out the RESP doing that.
No,
So once they're past that first semester, then it can be 28,000 the next year, or 25,000 withdrawn as EAP. And nobody cares. The government doesn't care about receipts. We don't care about the receipts for what was spent on. It's just as long as we have that enrollment letter confirming that junior is attending whatever university full time, that's sufficient. And again, even if tuition was only $10,000, it's usually less even for a semester in Canada here. But let's say you come up with the costs are $10,000, but it's $100,000 RESP. You saved all your life in that plan. It's built up to $100,000 for junior. There's no reason you want to leave money in this plan. You want to use that EAP, get as much out as possible. And even if junior just needs the $10,000, take $20,000, $25,000, whatever works in the overall plan. Talk about that with your financial planner, what works. And you can just shovel that into a TFSA or somewhere else.
It's a great point. And you talked about that. So students, generally speaking, when you hit post-secondary after high school, right, they're going to be hitting around 17, 18. Within a year or two, or even at that time, they will be eligible to open up a TFSA, right? And, direct line correlation or dotted line, money coming in, money coming out, right? Like as long as you now could potentially, to your point, contribute in the student's TFSA, which will then be fully tax-free indefinitely into the future, or maybe even now an FHSA if they choose to, right? And then they'll get a bit of a, they'll get, a shelter that way for their house and whatnot, right? So there are ways to be able to then still have those funds in the child in junior's hands, but now instead of in the RESP, right, with somebody that actually in name owns it, right? It's now fully in the student's name, and for them to be able to take out of their TFSA in the future if they need to, right?
We just moved it from one bucket to another, and not doesn't necessarily have to be spent. And again, the gist of this is that the government doesn't care. They're not limiting you to what you can take out. They are limiting.
Don't take out. But it's much higher. 30,000. Yeah, don't take out 30,000. Take 27.
Much higher than what you think it is. Yeah. Yes. And then too, the capital withdrawals. So that's the other thing where a lot of parents take that capital out early. Really, that should be left for last. And it might depend situation to situation. If junior is maybe doing a co-op job, maybe they are going to be at a certain tax level. You don't want to have too much extra taxable income coming out of the RESP. So it's different from person to person, but more often than not, if they're not doing any type of high income work, their gross income while they're in school is well below, say, $20,000. They're not going to be paying a lot of tax. You want to then take more money, whatever you're allowed to as EAP withdrawals, have a tax, and then later on take the capital out of the plan. But that is another thing too. You need to take that capital out at some points too. What also kind of sparked this conversation of this podcast is a great video put out by Mark Walhoot. I think that's how we pronounce his name. I'll link it as well somewhere. If this is on YouTube, I'll see if I can put it on the screen somewhere, or link it in the notes underneath. But he did a little bit, about a 10-minute video on what to do when it comes to withdrawing your money if your kid doesn't go to school. And we won't go too much into the details there. I do recommend watching that video. I'm sending out to all my clients in my next newsletter. What happens? So once the kid is no longer in school, we'll just kind of summarize this. Then you're making these capital withdrawals as non-education capital withdrawals. You lose the grant money, and any type of money that otherwise would have come out as an EAP now comes out as an accumulated income payment, which is fully taxable, taxable at your marginal tax rate, plus penalized by 20% because you saved on taxes all these years. The money was in an RESP. Government wants to make some of that extra money back that they could have collected from you if this money was saved outside of an RESP. So you're hit with this penalty 20%. Now, the nice thing is, and this is very common knowledge from what I've heard, which is that you can put this money into an RSP, Registered Retirement Savings Plan. So if you have
your own RRSP,
yes, the subscriber's own RRSP. If you have the contribution space, so what you're doing then is you're taking this money, instead of having the tax bill on this money, you're putting it into an RRSP that offsets the tax bill, and you offset that 20% penalty, which is another nice thing with RESPs. Even if you think your kids are not that smart, might not go to school, as long as you're not maxing out your RRSP, you may have that chance then to put that money into your RRSP like that.
You do need the contribution space. You just can't put it across in kind. You need to have the contribution space in your own RSP in order to doing so. But the option is there to offset the tax, the penalty that would be applied for taking it out. One other suggestion that does come up as well, excuse me, is that, when I think about it, in some ways, some people have said university is like the new high school, right? And master's degrees maybe like the new undergrad, right? And so on and so forth, right? So you never know. A child might go back to school in the future, right?
Exactly.
Maybe the careers, they didn't like this. Or maybe they decided, I love this. I need to pursue this further. I want to get my master's in education. I want to change careers and do an undergrad in this. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a full undergrad, right? There's lots of other eligible institutions that you can use it for. Pilot training, cosmetology,
vocational school.
Vocational school, exactly.
Anything,
So the option
part-time
also does exist that if you think your child might want, you could just keep it open. Like an RESP can stay open for 35 years, well past the initial graduation of the child. And until that endpoint, maybe you might want to hold on to the RSP. And again, that's where you talk to your advisor and say, hey, should we or should we not? Or I got RSP contribution space, maybe I could move it into. But the option is there because more people are getting further, MBAs, quite a few MBAs out there these days, right? You wouldn't believe how many engineers and MBAs there are out there. But yes, MBAs, other master's programs, other programs entirely, right? You can still use an RESP down the road. It doesn't have to be sequentially right after the undergraduate program.
Yeah, exactly. That's a really good point there. And I've personally never seen a client collapse an RESP under an accumulated income payment, with exception to some very small RESPs where we're just there's the last little bit in there. Let's just close it off. But if you still have an RESP for kids who are older, there's no reason. It's not necessary to act just yet on that. I mean, look into your documents. How old is that RESP plan? How long have you had an RESP for the kids? Maybe you're getting close to the. I think RESPs never really became popular until the late 90s. So I don't think anyone should be close to the 35 years yet, even if it was open for kids born in the 90s.
So there's a lot of options, and I think to your point or observation is that we are getting to that time frame where in the next few years or so we're going to see some more case examples of subscribers potentially collapsing or actually looking to the point where what do I do with this? Or where I've seen certain case studies like there's like a significantly large RESP, like they bought in some, call it, I don't know, cannabis name, or maybe they bought nothing but NVIDIA 5 years ago, right? And all of a sudden there's more money than the kid presumably could even use to spend for school, right? And then there's a different situation altogether there, right? We're going to start seeing a little bit more case coming up where we'll see how does the CRA treat this or that, right? And we'll certainly be on tabs of that as it progresses, because it is getting only right around to the point where that maturity is coming into play.
So I'll summarize some of these points on a separate blog post. Basically, I think the main takeaway I think from this conversation is when it comes to withdrawals, do some thinking about it. Don't just kind of be inclined to do whatever your first inclination is, I guess, which is maybe taking the tax-free withdrawal. or taking minimal withdrawals, just nibbling away at that RESP, you do want to have a plan, not just for that money to be able to cover education costs for your kid, but have a plan for how does that money come out of that plan. That's the goal. At some point, you've got this window open. You need to take the money out of the plan, or you should anyways in most cases. How do we take the money out efficiently while the window is open? And in a worst case scenario, you don't want to be in a situation where your kids or all the beneficiaries in the plan are over, say, the age of 25, where there's still a lot of money in the plan. In those types of situations, maybe there's a way they can use the money as education assistance payments, but the odds are less, right? The kids are less likely to do some kind of other education past the age of 25 if they're not continuing on with something already.
Yeah. When I was a university student, did not have an RESP, right? I mean,
Same
there
here.
wasn't time for it, right? You went away to the United States for school. I can't imagine that was cheap. It was expensive, but all those costs would have been eligible.
Yep.
In my case, I potentially could have changed undergrad programs, but I didn't. But also what happened was that I had co-op jobs in the latter portion, in the last 3 years of my 5-year program. And that income from the co-op program put me well over, my basic personal amount, right? And so then I did have to pay some taxes and what have you, or like I had to think about this as a student, right? It wasn't a lot, but I had to be mindful of my contributions to RRSPs and my tuition amounts and all of that, right? But it's a factor, and there's more and more co-op and intern type programs that are out there now, right? So, even if I think of myself or even yourself, right? You as well.
I had a co-op job too.
Educational expenses.
Yeah, I had a co-op job too. Was making pretty decent coin. I mean, back then, $17 US an hour. Working full time for half a year. Lots of overtime too. So, if I had an RESP, then that would have been the year. And again, there's so much planning that can be done. If I had an RESP, my parents could have that year decided to just done capital withdrawals, and the other years when I wasn't working at all, those were the years to have done education assistance payments. There's so much flexibility around this.
Yes,
but again, just going with your first inclination or just what option a person at a bank offers you, you need to put some more thought to it. There needs to be planning around the withdrawals from an RESP. It's the most important part of the RESP, the overall education savings plan, is when the money comes out. When money goes in, who cares? Money goes in, gets grants.
How do we spend it? How do we take it out and spend it, right? We're not talking about...
And like I said, you don't necessarily have to spend it. You can.
That's true.
Just how do you take it out?
We need to take
move
out
it to another bucket.
How do we efficiently take out funds? Yes. Is that the exercise, the mental practice of going through this and having that conversation with your advisor and say, this is my situation, this is my children's situation. Do you recall your first year tuition? I remember to the cent my first year's tuition.
Well, I mean, my first year tuition was at Grant MacEwan Community College.
Yeah.
And it seemed like a lot of money to me back then, but I think we were talking about $2,200
for
first semester.
For a semester.
So maybe for the year it ended up. Yeah. What was your full year at the U of A?
My full year, engineering, I had a slightly heavier course load than other undergrad programs, right? But it was $4,008.86. And my friends that were in general science or in arts were paying somewhere around $3,300. So not to shock people, because we all went through that. So this is 25 years ago.
You're saying that was full year or full semester?
Tuition and fees, full year, $4,008.86.
I thought it was much more than that. I thought it was more like $8,000.
That doesn't include the books. It doesn't include the books, doesn't include the other things, but just,
books and other fees,
just the tuition and fees.
So going then to Northeastern University in Boston, there we're talking about, I think it was about $4,000 per course. So a semester, or maybe it was 3,000 a course. They were not semesters back then; they were quarters. Yeah. And each quarter, I think, was about $12,000 US in terms of tuition only. And so again, that was 20 something years ago. So I know it's a lot more now. Now if you're looking at a year, the semesters when they converted from quarters to semesters ended up being more like 15,000. So a typical year there was 30,000 US. Luckily my situation was that I did those couple of years at Grant MacEwan first, so it wasn't quite that big of a toll to my parents. But certainly, if doing a 4-year degree there, that'd be quite costly. And when we do these RESP projections in terms of education costs down the road, even in Canada, with the inflation that we've seen, it's not that unlikely that costs will be about $100,000 for a 4-year degree. for
If I needed to totally speculate, who knows? We've seen so many changes with all the other registered plans, TFSAs, RSPs, what have you, right? Our FHISAs. Who knows down the road that there might be some other changes to the RESP, recognizing that the expenses to education the inflation rate on education is much higher than the average CPI. Right.
And just while we're finishing things off here, let's harp on one other thing that we mentioned last year, which still hasn't changed, which should be changed at some point. One is the $50,000 annual contribution, lifetime contribution limit, which hasn't changed in 15 years or so.
Mm-hmm.
The other is the $7,200 grant limit, which is still from back in the days when they would only do $400 of grant per year. At 7,200, basically, it comes from 18 times 400, because it used to be the original CESG was $400 on your $2,000 contribution, your first $2,000 of contributions, and over 18 years, it was 7,200. Today, you're getting $500 on $2,500, but it's still 7,200, which makes the math really hard. If they raise that to 7,500, I think is what they would need to do for it to be.
All right, politicians, you heard this.
Yeah.
Nudge, nudge.
So it should be 9,000. At least get it to 9,000, right? And then if you really want to talk about inflation, it should be more than that. And people probably should be putting more than $2,500 a year aside. To tell you the truth, when it comes to the plans I do, the financial plans, education savings plans, if you do the $2,500 a year, getting that max CESG, it gets you to a point after 18 years where you've got enough for that future education of about $15,000 a year in today's dollars. It just barely gets you there. I think, though, if inflation continues to push up those costs, we're going to get to a point where doing that typical amount to the RESP is not going to be enough. Now, if you put in $50,000 at birth, if you could afford that, you'll probably be fine. You'll be better off then. But with what most parents are doing, it might get to the point. I'm talking a few years from now, a bit more of inflation, where it won't be sufficient. You'll still have to have some additional savings outside of the RESP, or the kids will have to work or
I suspect
borrow.
that somewhere down the road that there'll be a change addressing these comments, right? But until it happens, we work with the numbers that we have in the plan and the rules that we have in place. But like every other plan, they've adjusted, and I wouldn't be surprised if down the road, I think you're in agreement, they'll probably change upwards, right, in the future. So we'll see when that happens. We have another podcast episode.
All right, sounds good.